conclusion of a 2-year investigation into Russian meddling leaves Democrats scrambling. The biggest threat to Donald Trump's presidency ends in a fizzle. But can he beat future investigations? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the Mueller report. As far as Donald Trump is concerned, it's a day of reckoning for his critics. After being cleared of conspiring with Russia to steal the Oval Office, Trump sat in the White House and told reporters his enemies will pay for doing evil and treasonous things. With that, Senate Republicans were quick to return to the president's side and announce an investigation into the investigation. But Democrats are not out of political ammunition just yet. Trump celebrated on Twitter, but he couldn't help telling a fib, saying he'd been totally exonerated. The thing is, that's not true. A summary of the Mueller report states Trump hasn't been cleared of obstruction of justice. And Democrats want to know, if the president didn't try to hide anything, why did so many people in his inner circle risk jail time by lying to the FBI? With more on this, here's Melinda Nusifora.
The president has never shown much respect for Robert Mueller's investigation.
It's a witch hunt. It's a witch hunt. That's all it is. This is a witch hunt, and it's a disgrace. It's a rigged witch hunt. It's a totally rigged deal. Fake news and the Russian witch hunt. We got a whole big combination. I will tell you, I love this country.
And now that it's all over, he says he was right all along.
There was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction, and none whatsoever.
Mueller was appointed in early 2017 to oversee an investigation into whether the president or members of his campaign colluded with Russia to influence the 2016 presidential election. 22 months later, the special counsel found there had been attempts to interfere with the vote through social media disinformation and computer hacking. But the special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in these efforts, despite multiple offers from Russian-affiliated individuals. But not everyone sees it that way.
President Trump is wrong. This report does not amount to a so-called total exoneration. Special Counsel Mueller was clear that his report, quote, does not exonerate, close quote, the president.
That's because after nearly 2 years, 500 witnesses and almost 3,000 subpoenas, Mueller couldn't categorically say whether or not the president obstructed the investigation. Mueller deferred that finding to the Attorney General, William Barr, who concluded that the evidence is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offence.
The Attorney General followed the legal process. He worked with the Deputy Attorney General, who's been involved since the very beginning of this 2-year absurdity, and they made a decision that there was no obstruction. So that makes it a complete and total exoneration. I don't know any other way to look at it.
The concern among some Democrats is that President Trump appointed Barr to the Attorney General's role in December, just months after the lawyer wrote an unsolicited memo criticising Mueller's investigation.
Bob Mueller spent 2 years looking at all the evidence, and he was unable to make a determination of whether the president obstructed justice or not. The Attorney General spent 2 days and made that determination. That wasn't fair. This needs to be looked at by the American people, by the committees.
Today, people are rereading that memo and saying, wait a second, there's a lot of opaque and sly language in this memo. Let's really look and see what's behind it. I don't want to read the Cliff Notes version of Macbeth. I want to read Macbeth myself.
After all the toil and trouble, Capitol Hill's cauldron still bubbles with questions. Melinda Nusifora, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in La Jolla, California by Harry Litman. He's a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Attorney General. And in Washington, D.C. is Republican strategist and the president of the Conservative Hispanic Leadership Council, Ivan Garcia Hidalgo. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Harry, let me start with you. So, special counsel's investigation did not establish collusion. Are you disappointed?
Well, no. I mean, I'm a prosecutor, so you're always looking for the truth. You know, it was clearly a righteous or a justified investigation. There were a lot of unusual points of connection between Russia and the United States. There's still the pending counterintelligence investigation to try to get to the bottom of the president's possible alliances or even compromise with Russia. It was something that certainly needed to be tracked down. And of course, we don't even know what the basis is for saying that he couldn't bring charges. It might be fairly technical, but I think it's something that the country obviously very much needed, and it would have been derelict to have not pursued it to the end.
And Harry, when someone like Adam Schiff, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, had said clearly, I think there's plenty of evidence of collusion and conspiracy in plain sight, he looks a bit foolish now, doesn't he?
No, I certainly would not say that. I mean, let's take a step back and look at everything we've been seeing in plain sight over the last 18 months. We have these very unusual encounters in the Seychelles Islands. We have the campaign manager passing on secret proprietary data and leaving by a separate door to a Russian operative. We have the campaign members saying, yes, bring it on, give us Hillary Clinton's dirt, and we love it. That is clearly evidence of collusion. That has to be distinguished between a finding by a prosecutor, which is a high standard. I've done it, you know, I did it myself for many years, that they could prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. But the idea that there is what isn't evidence of collusion is spurious. Of course, there was and is and was a matter of concern. So Schiff needn't be embarrassed at all.
Okay, so Ivan, there was evidence, just not enough that could be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Do you accept that, Ivan?
No, absolutely. There was absolutely no evidence. This was nothing more than a witch hunt. It comes down to the following: is Democrats were more concerned about which bathroom to use. They came up with a pathetic candidate, a pathetic strategy. They got their ass kicked in the election in 2016. They couldn't handle it. They're still crying about it. And they created this ghost and this story about collusion. The only situation here, the only collusion is what happened, like Senator Lindsey Graham said yesterday, and everybody in the media should be absolutely embarrassed, and they're a disgrace. The Pulitzer Prize should be pulled for the New York Times and the Washington Post. CNN, MSNBC, and the rest of those radical organizations need to reevaluate. And that's why their ratings are piss poor. You look at CNN, they have a credibility rating of 19%. MSNBC and others around 14. Washington Post and New York Times are a joke. You know, you look at that situation, and that's really what it comes down to. They lost. They have no credibility. They had no strategy, and that's all they're pushing. There's Russian collusion garbage, and now that it's out, they've been saying for 2 years that once the Mueller report is out, now it's out, now you have people like this guy coming on here and on other channels saying that no, there is no clarity, the president is not exonerated.
Who was it a witch hunt?
Pathetic. They're absolutely sore losers,
the witch hunt,
and they're going to lose again in 2020.
Ivan,
That's
who was
really
conducting
what it
the
comes
witch
down
hunt?
to.
Who was conducting the witch hunt?
What do you mean, who was conducting it?
Well, I mean, okay, you say it's a witch hunt. Who's doing it?
Have you been in like a time capsule or something, or what?
Who's doing the witch hunt? If you say there's a witch hunt, who was doing it? Who was going after the president?
It was all created. It was all created by people in the Obama administration. Look at the situation with McCabe. Look at Comey. Look at Peter Strzok. Look at Lisa Page. Look at the Christopher Steele dossier. What are you talking about?
So Ivan is displaying a shocking.
Those are the things that now are gonna. Those are the things that now are gonna be looked at. That have been swept under the table for 2.5 years. This Russian crap started under the Obama administration What did he do about it? Nothing.
Okay, let's ask Harry.
He tried to take over.
Let me just briefly respond.
Ivan, give me a second here. Ivan, give me a second, right? Okay, so
Ivan,
Harry.
may I briefly respond?
Okay, so Harry, you can respond with
just a
this.
quick response to that.
Okay,
Yes,
so
I'm
Harry,
sorry,
respond, but also respond to the fact that the president feels completely vindicated and feels completely exonerated, even though that's not exactly what came out. The president said, no collusion, no obstruction, complete and total exoneration, keep America great. That's what he tweeted, even though the text of it didn't say complete exoneration, but that's park that off. Respond to Ivan and respond to the president, who feel vindicated that this was a witch hunt, there was nothing in it, and now you guys have been exposed, whoever you guys are.
Sure. I mean, Ivan just went off on a great detour and frolic about political considerations, etc. He just has a shocking ignorance of how the legal system works. This so-called witch hunt was initiated by a Republican with the appointment of another Republican who is understood throughout the country to be the finest prosecutor of his day. He's made conclusions but hasn't addressed at all, of course, the wealth of evidence that he did go through. And lucky for him that Robert Mueller is a very honorable, straight up man. But the notion that it's somehow a Democratic plant is absurd on its face. In terms of Trump, this is his kind of braggadocio. He has been this way from the start, but of course it's a very tepid, clean bill of health to say doesn't quite reach the level of criminal conduct, and even more so on the obstruction side, where not only did Mueller not exonerate him, he said specifically, I do not exonerate him. And we do not know the reason that he declined to find there was criminal conduct, even there beyond a reasonable doubt. That's something we're going to need to know. It's not this political crass, excuse me, Ivan, it's not this political crass mud battle. It's something of grave concern for the country that's important to know the truth of. And if you just close your eyes and see it as a Democratic witch hunt, you'll be disserving the people who need to understand what happened with Russia in 2016.
Well, that's why Dershowitz and other great attorneys, lawyers, have said that Trump is absolutely 100% vindicated. The people that have been charged were process crimes. You have 675 days of investigation, 19 lawyers, 13 who were partisan Democrat, 40 FBI agents, forensic accountants, and thousands of subpoenas, 500 witnesses, etc.
Is it your view that the investigation should not have occurred?
With a $25 million price tag, all because you lost an election.
Yeah.
All because you lost an election. That is pathetic. It is sad. Look what
Ivan, is it your
CNN and
view
the rest
that the
of that
investigation should never have
everything on the
occurred?
left have been doing for 2.5 years. They've been running around saying mountains of evidence. There is collusion. Every single second you would turn on CNN or one of those jokes, and they would say, breaking news, the latest from the Russian investigation, the latest on the Mueller report. All these bogus stories, Pulitzer Prize for the New York Times and Washington Post with amazing coverage. Where are they now? Egg on their face. They're a joke. They're an absolute joke. And that is reality.
Is it your view that the investigation should never have occurred?
Harry, I think he's made it clear.
Okay.
All right, okay, so Harry, I think he's made it clear that he believes that all of that was a waste of time. I want you to address one more thing for me, Harry, but first I want to swap out Ivan. Ivan.
Sure.
I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. We're going to do a little switch now.
Thank you, Ivan.
Pleasure having you back on the program.
Thank you, Harry. Good meeting you.
Tag team.
Let's thank him. Let's bring in Paul Rosenzweig, who was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. Harry, I'm going to get your response in a second, but I want to ask Paul a question straight out the gate first. Paul, has justice been served? Does this make sense? When you read the line, the special counsel states that while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. Because a lot of people find it sort of wishy-washy, and Trump feels exonerated, and as we heard from Ivan, they see it as a victory. How do you feel about it, Paul?
I think I'm closer to where Harry is on this. I think it is a good thing that the process has worked. I think that it is wholly appropriate to have conducted an investigation into allegations of Russian interference into the American 2016 election. I think what's lost in some of what you've been talking about is the fact that other aspects of Mueller's investigation have confirmed what we all suspected, which is that the Russians did, in fact, engage in significant efforts to interfere with the American election, most specifically through social media campaigns and through crimes, through cyber hacking of the Democratic National Committee. Now, that's worth knowing, if only because that gives us something to work on to fix, to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Right. I am also pleased, actually, to learn that there was insufficient evidence to prove that the president is a co-conspirator with the Russian government. That should have been the bottom line of what we wanted to hear. And I'm glad to hear that the president is innocent of being a Russian agent.
Right. A lot of people are so upset.
That doesn't mean that he's a great president.
In the culture wars in the U.S., a lot of people on the other side of the fence are so upset that there's no proof that their president is a Russian agent, which, as an outsider, I find completely fascinating. Harry, I want you to address a point that was made by Ivan, because he said, all those people who went to jail, we've got this beautiful video wall behind me with, the 7 or so people who went to jail over this period of 2 years, the Manaforts and the Papadopouloses and the Cohens who faced the music. Ivan said those were process crimes. They're not necessarily connected to the president or the fact that there's evidence of collusion. So naturally people go, why did all those people go to jail if everything was kosher? But is it a fair argument to say those were just process crimes?
Thank you. No, I mean, I think it's unfair in a lot of ways. First, these so-called process crimes are extremely usual in a large investigation of this sort, where you work your way up. But here, it's bigger than that. First, there are many crimes that are not process crimes of tax fraud and bank fraud and the like. But we have this continuing question. We have Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort, and yes, the President of the United States and others who were continually lying about both in public and to Congress and to the special prosecutor about the events with Russia. Why is that? If everything was completely clean and there was no connections with Russia, we still have a need to answer that question.
If they lied that much, Harry, sorry to interrupt you, and I apologize, Harry. If they lied that much, wouldn't it have been so easy for Mueller to say, yes, there was obstruction because they lied, but he did not draw a conclusion? Why do you think he still hung a big question mark over that?
Okay, so 2 points. First, I mean, it's not just enough to lie for obstruction. There's certain intent and the like. But you pose a great question. To me, it's the $64,000 question that now remains. It's so unusual that a prosecutor would go all the way and then not make a judgment. We really need to determine why. If he did it based on evidence, it's one thing. If he did it based on policy, it's another. And basically, it's not wishy-washy yet. It's a question mark. We don't know exactly what Mueller concluded and why he concluded it. It's important to know.
And taking that a step further, Paul, should this be made public for the American people and everybody else to go through properly and decide for themselves?
Well, I think most of the report can and will be made public going forward. There is no reason to think that Attorney General Barr is going to conceal more of it than is necessary. We have certain rules about grand jury secrecy, for example, that will probably be honored. But I'm expecting that a large fraction of this, including, most importantly, as Harry has noted, Mr. Mueller's analysis of why it is he chose not to do the obstruction charges, will be made public, and that'll be for the American public to kind of examine for themselves and form their own judgment, especially with respect to whether or not that calls into question the president's conduct in office, even if it's not criminal.
Right. So, Harry, grand jury information, fine, that can be redacted, but you want to read everything, don't you?
I mean, yes, one would like to. In Watergate, you did. It's a tough kind of balance in the law. You have a very strong public interest here, but then you have the interest of the uncharged people in the grand jury. There's the ability for a court to pass it on to Congress, but it's a tough calculus. In Watergate, it was a little bit easier. There were no really interests left except the president, Nixon, who said, send it over. Here, there are probably others. It's going to be a tough calculation and a legal battle.
Yeah, there are those who say, on, I guess, the red side of the aisle, or those who support Trump the most, who say, no further indictments, time to move on. And then there are others, including, well, the president, Paul, who has suggested things like, well, we need to investigate the investigators. This is an outrage. This has been a waste of time. Is he being bombastic or is he serious? Like, are we possibly going to see some attempt at punishment from the White House and the Trump administration at those who dared go after Trump?
As a political matter, I think that the president is one of those who always attempts to punish his political enemies. So we're likely to see that. As a matter of law, I think it is really very unlikely that the Department of Justice will open up a significant investigation of Hillary Clinton or the FBI agents. They don't want to go back to that any more than most of the rest of the country does. I'm sure your earlier guest, Ivan, would love to go back and keep refighting the 2016 election for the rest of his life, but most people don't want to do that.
Okay, Harry, do you expect a counterattack from Trump?
I agree completely with Paul. I expect a political counterattack. I expect talking points. I expect a rallying of the base, but there's no legal basis, and I don't expect any kind of Department of Justice inquiry by Bill Barr or anyone else.
Okay, gentlemen, it's been really good talking to all of you. Harry Litman, Paul Rosenzweig, and earlier Ivan Garcia Hidalgo.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much. See you again.
Thank you very much.
Still to come in the newsmakers, did U.S. airstrikes kill civilians in Somalia? Amnesty International says it has exposed the cover-up. And the U.S. denies visas to members of the International Criminal Court. But will it prevent them from investigating suspected war crimes in Afghanistan? Since taking office, Donald Trump has expanded military operations in Somalia. The fight is against al-Shabaab, and while the U.S. military has conducted more than 100 airstrikes during the past 2 years, it says there have been no civilian casualties. Now, in a new report, Amnesty International rejects that claim, saying it looked at just 5 airstrikes and uncovered 14 civilian deaths. The organization says the Trump administration is not only killing Somalis under a shroud of secrecy, but it's doing so to possibly cover up war crimes. Randolph Nogel reports.
Terrorist groups such as ISIS, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and Al-Qaeda also threaten African peace. The United States is proud to work with you to eradicate terrorist safe havens, to cut off their finances, and to discredit their depraved ideology.
It's been 2 years since the Trump administration gave the Pentagon approval to expand its fight against al-Qaeda's affiliate in Somalia, al-Shabaab. Since then, U.S. airstrikes against the group have increased threefold. But they've failed to make an impact on the ferocity of al-Shabaab attacks. These pictures are of the terror group's longest siege since it was forced out of Somalia's capital, Mogadishu, in 2011. On March the 1st, after a 22-hour battle between al-Shabaab gunmen and security forces, 29 people were dead. There have been at least 2 other al-Shabaab attacks in Mogadishu since. One of the lesser-known death tolls, however, is Somali civilians killed in U.S. drone attacks. The Pentagon maintains that figure is 0. But an investigation carried out by Amnesty International says 5 airstrikes have killed 14 civilians in the past 2 years. The report found the U.S. was responsible for deaths in 4 of the airstrikes, and likely the 5th. The strikes were carried out in the Lower Shabelle in southern Somalia. Just months after his inauguration, President Donald Trump not only expanded the U.S. fight against al-Shabaab, but he also designated parts of Somalia as areas of active hostilities. There are concerns that new designation allows people to be considered lawful targets based on location, age, and gender. It raises the question, who does the U.S. consider a civilian in areas where al-Shabaab has control or influence? The Amnesty report concludes, relaxed rules of engagement have led to mistakes, and some U.S. drone attacks could constitute war crimes. But the U.S. is not technically at war. The man leading U.S. military operations in Africa said this month at a congressional hearing, "I wouldn't characterize we're at war. It's specifically designed for us not to own that." The U.S. military says the Amnesty report isn't accurate, and that it goes to extraordinary lengths to reduce the likelihood of civilian casualties. It also says it didn't conduct an airstrike at the time and place of one of the 5 allegations in the Amnesty report. The U.S. is on track this year to double the airstrikes it carried out in Somalia in 2018. The report has raised concerns that the escalation of military action isn't being met with proportionate action and accountability. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in New York is Brian Kastner, who wrote Amnesty International's report on American airstrikes in Somalia. In Mogadishu is Abdurazak Omar Mohammed, a member of the Somali parliament and a former internal security minister. Gentlemen, good to have you on the Newsmakers. Brian, let me start with you. Are you absolutely convinced that these airstrikes have killed civilians?
We are, especially in these 5 cases. Last week, AFRICOM, U.S. Africa Command, released a statement that they have done in the last 2 years. They've done 110 strikes, killed 800 terrorists, and killed absolutely 0 civilians. And that's just not a number that's credible and makes sense. We know how war works.
Okay,
and
let's
so in
ask,
the 5 cases that we've documented this report.
Yeah, let's ask the parliamentarian, Abdurazak Omar Mohammed. Who's closer to the truth, Amnesty or AFRICOM?
I think Amnesty is close to the truth. In fact, I think the numbers they have presented is very conservative when you look at the number of airstrikes that Americans have undertaken since 2017. So I think it's very clear because we have cases where families of victims are unable to come to the city to report civilian casualties. So I think the number could have been much greater than that.
Right. And Brian, we reached out to AFRICOM. They pointed us to their statement. So they sent us the link to the same statement that they made. And of course, a lot of it is sort of boilerplate stuff. We've seen with Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, we have precision military equipment, and we take extreme measures to prevent, this and that civilians don't die. But there's something that was fascinating within that statement where they speak about al-Shabaab, and they say specifically it is in the interest of the terrorist group al-Shabaab to untruthfully claim civilian casualties. It is also in the interest of al-Shabaab to coerce community members to make untrue claims. So amid all of that, Brian, they're suggesting that Amnesty is getting played a little bit by al-Shabaab on the ground, or they're pulling a fast one on you. Address that for me.
Sure. Yes. I mean, al-Shabaab propaganda is real. People have all sorts of incentives to lie, whether they be political because of al-Shabaab or financial incentives if they think there's going to be some sort of financial compensation that is coming. I can tell you that we investigated 15 strikes total. And out of those 15, we only published 5 because the other 10 did not rise to our high evidentiary threshold. So while I'm sure AFRICOM is right that those things happen generally, in the 5 cases that we documented with 14 dead and 8 injured, we are sure that we're not being played.
And Abdurazak Omar Mohammed, when, as a Somali parliamentarian and within the Somali government, when the Somali government approaches AFRICOM and has questions about these things, do the Americans listen?
No, actually, because Somalia was designated as an area of active hostility, which means that they don't consult with the government of Somalia when they are doing those airstrikes. But let me get back to the other question that you have asked, Brian. There was a joint operation of Somali National Army and American Special Forces in August 2017, where 10 civilians were killed. And when the families of the victims came to the city, and they said that we will not bury them. And this has been published in Daily Beast in August, I think in November 2017. Mm-hmm. So when the report was published, AFRICOM has denied killing any civilians in that operation. But the raid is in Berry village, just outside of Afgoye city. When the families came and MPs pressured the government to investigate the case, the government has admitted of killing civilians. They have compensated 10 civilians who were killed in that raid. So AFRICOM is not coming forward to tell the truth. The second question that you have asked me is because of Somalia, since Somalia was designated as an area of active hostility, there's no that second layer of scrutiny.
Right.
In the past, there was interstate vetting. There is nothing. Mm-hmm. They can just call for an airstrike and they will do it. They don't consult with the Somali
this is
government.
Fascinating.
They just.
Yeah. Let me just follow up on this with you, Abdurazak, right? Because I might sound very naive when I ask this question, but in February there was news. Well, they came out and they said that they killed 35 Shabab fighters in Hiran as the group was trying to mass their forces, right? So these were precision strikes. So if I understand this fully, you as a Somali parliamentarian would get the news when I get the news that these people have been killed. Is that what happens?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens, because even not only as a Somali parliamentarian, they don't even consult with the executive branch when they are planning to take airstrikes. They don't consult with the Somali president in advance to tell them that they are going to strike in such area. So just like you get it from the news, that's how we get the news when airstrikes happen in Somalia.
So Brian, we have the U.S. saying, well, this is for not only for the good of the Horn of Africa and for, you know, geostrategically for the region. It's good for Somalia if Shabab is being destroyed. But the fact that they're not consulting with any Somali partners on the ground, what does that mean from your perspective?
Well, I should say that AFRICOM says that everything that they do is in support of the Somali government. And so I think that they have told us that they consult, who they consult with, how often they consult. Do they tell everyone beforehand, or do they only tell afterwards? There's just a real lack of transparency in in a lot of AFRICOM's operations. And I would include in that, most important for Amnesty, is who exactly do they classify as al-Shabaab, and who do they classify as an al-Shabaab network or the al-Shabaab affiliate, and whether everyone that they're striking would be considered a combatant under international humanitarian law. That is not clear to us, and that's why we've asked AFRICOM to investigate and others to investigate exactly who, like you say, when they kill 30-something, 20-something, who are all these people?
Yeah, and one of the questions I had for AFRICOM, if we could have gotten one of their spokespersons on the show, was that, okay, those numbers that Brian mentioned earlier on, Abdurazak, the US saying 110 strikes in 2 years, killing more than 800 people. Every single one of them, according to AFRICOM, verifiably Shabab or linked to Shabab, Al-Qaeda, and so on. If that is the case, wouldn't you expect, Abdurazak, it to be more difficult for Shabab to blow things up in Mogadishu in 2019, which is still what they're doing?
Absolutely. If what they are saying is the truth. First of all, I don't believe that there are zero casualty in those drone and airstrikes. But what I think, the Al-Shabaab lives in villages where normal civilians live. So, under the policy framework of the active Somalia as an area of active hostility, It means that any enemy combatants, even perceived person, will be attacked regardless of whether that person is Al-Shabaab or not. If what the AFRICOM is saying is the truth and that there was zero civilian casualties, then the attacks, the symmetric attacks that Al-Shabaab is doing in cities like Mogadishu would have substantially declined. But instead, it has increased, actually. The number of civilians, the number has gone up when you compare to the previous years.
Brian, there's a line in the report where they say our assessments are based on post-strike analysis using intelligence methods not available to non-military organizations. Sounds very, I know what you do not know, so don't ask questions. How do you read that as Amnesty?
Well, it is certainly true that AFRICOM knows things don't. It takes us months to figure out exactly what day a strike happened, what the target was, the exact grid location. They know all this stuff before they even start the investigation. This is what's frustrating, is that they start so far ahead of where we would, and yet we're able to find these cases of civilian casualties and they aren't. And I think it's honestly because they do an very initial assessment. They see maybe that the allegation came from an Al-Shabaab friendly news site. They dismiss the allegation as not credible, and then they don't speak to anyone. And we conducted over 150 interviews on the ground, some of those on the ground in Mogadishu, some of them remotely. And in every single case, the people we spoke to, eyewitnesses, family members, survivors of the strikes, they told us that they had never spoken to a Somali government official before. They had never spoken to an American government official before. So I think this is a case where, yes, AFRICOM knows some stuff we don't, but I think we know things they don't. And so when you put the two together, that's why we're asking them to use our information and conduct their own investigation.
Very finally, your report's called The Hidden U.S. War in Somalia. Did you call it the hidden U.S. war because nobody's really talking about it?
Well, obviously, people in Somalia are talking about it, and the civilians that are caught in between the airstrikes and Al-Shabaab know about it. But as far as in the United States, no, it's very much in the back burner. There's not a lot of transparency from AFRICOM. There hasn't been a lot of news coverage. And so the number of strikes have just gone up and up and up. The number of civilians possibly killed has gone up. And it has not gotten the attention that we think it deserves.
Yeah, and what is fascinating, certainly what is fascinating, just in conclusion, is that even if everything they said was true, it's fascinating how this isn't even in the American public discourse. Even if it was true that 800 terrorists were killed over the past 2 years, with over 100 airstrikes, is not even a footnote in foreign policy right now in those conversations. It's fascinating. Brian, I thank you very much for joining us. And Abdurrazak Omar Mohammed, the parliamentarian from Somalia as well. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers.
I'm announcing a policy of U.S. visa restrictions on those individuals directly responsible for any ICC investigation of U.S. personnel. This includes persons who take or have taken action to request or further such an investigation.
The International Criminal Court is looking into allegations of U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan, but Washington will have none of it. The State Department says any misconduct by U.S. forces will be investigated by the United States in the United States, and that if visa restrictions aren't enough to deter the ICC, economic sanctions will be on the cards. Those threats were dismissed by the UN court, which says its investigation will continue with or without the consent of the White House. Well, joining me now to discuss this from Taipei is the former Asia chairman of Republicans Abroad, Ross Feingold. And in Bloomington, Indiana, we have David Bosco. He's an associate professor at Indiana University and the author of Rough Justice, the International Criminal Court in a World of Power Politics. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Ross, let me start with you. Straight out the gate, does the U.S. have something to hide? That's why it's revoking and denying those visas?
Well, the concern is not something to hide. Clearly, the political environment in the United States, and actually I think this increasingly applies not just to Republicans, I should say, but to Democrats as well, that there's an increasing skepticism towards multilateral organizations among U.S. politicians and certainly the U.S. public. And clearly for many years, U.S. governments have not had confidence. Again, this is whether it's executive branch, regardless of who's been the president, because this continued under President Obama, as well as in the Congress, again, regardless of who's the majority, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, that there's a skepticism about these multilateral organizations and a perception that America will not get fair treatment. And we see the result, that there's a great reluctance by the United States to participate in these organizations.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, under the Democrats, it was the same. David Bosco, is the rule of thumb that the U.S. will support the ICC for as long as it's going after Balkan and African leaders, but don't you dare look at us?
Well, certainly the U.S. position since the early 1990s has been very supportive overall of international justice, and the U.S. was one of the leading funder for the Yugoslav Tribunal, which you referred to, and for the Rwanda Tribunal. The U.S. has always had, across different administrations, hesitations about the structure of the ICC, because the ICC claims to have jurisdiction over even nationals of non-member states. So states who have decided not to join the ICC, the court's view is that in certain circumstances they can have jurisdiction over the citizens of those states. And that is something that no U.S. administration, from Clinton to Obama, George W. Bush, and now Trump, has accepted. And so, you know, I think there is a certain consistency here, which is a rejection of ICC jurisdiction over Americans.
Yeah, and David, Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor at the ICC, when Afghanistan was mentioned, there's this initiative to look into possible war crimes, alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, it's not just the U.S. that's being looked at. It's the Afghan army, Afghan security forces, Haqqani network, and Taliban, and so on. Why does the United States feel attacked by that investigation?
Well, they feel attacked because it includes the U.S., but you're quite right that the situation in Afghanistan from the ICC's perspective is much, much broader than any allegations against the U.S., and probably the focus of any investigation would be attacks by the Taliban, some activity by the Afghan government, certainly. But there is this component in there of these, you know, several dozen, something like that, cases of alleged torture by the U.S. that would be part of it. And for the U.S., I think the point of view is, so long as that's part of it, we are not going to be supportive of any investigation. I should say, incidentally, that the Afghan government does not seem to have any desire for a role for the ICC in the country either. And that's a very relevant point.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? So, Ross, let me give you a little example. In the segment that preceded this one, we spoke about Somalia. So even though Somalia is not being looked at by the ICC right now, just kind of bear with me for a second here. So we had AFRICOM giving a statement, and we had the Somali government, and we had Amnesty International. So the United States said more than 100 airstrikes over the past 2 years, killed 800 al-Shabaab, no civilian casualties. That's our statement. We investigated, and there's nothing to look at here. Amnesty International saying there might be a cover-up of war crimes because we've investigated just 5 of those, and we find at least 14 civilian casualties. So the U.S. has investigated itself, and it said, we're exonerated. Don't you think to get to the bottom of it, you need some sort of international body like the ICC to go, okay, who's telling the truth? Were civilians killed? Ross?
Well, if stakeholders such as international organizations or the Somali government or local government in the area where these attacks want to welcome international organizations, there is a limit to what the U.S. could do to stop. In fact, it would be a reach to say the U.S. is insisting that international organizations or other stakeholders don't investigate these cases. But regardless of what kind of investigation that occurs, what the United States is saying is we've done our own organization, and we're not participating in this particular multilateral institution, the ICC, that would allow the investigation or potentially prosecution of U.S. service people, especially when the U.S. has already conducted what it will claim. Understandably, the U.S. will claim that it's conducted a robust internal investigation, and that, in fact, the U.S., compared to many other militaries, does have a very robust set of regulations that govern airstrikes.
Mm-hmm. And David, when we read Pompeo's statement, the Secretary of State also mentioning Israel and saying we want to protect ourselves and our allies, Israel, because they feel that there's this unfair attack on the United States and the Israelis? Help me understand that a bit more, David.
Yeah, so I think the situation in Palestine is kind of the looming situation that may even be as important or perhaps even more important from a U.S. perspective on the ICC, because we do have what the ICC calls a preliminary examination of the situation in Palestine. And from an Israeli perspective, the danger of that is that it might include settlements, the policy of settlements, which could be construed as a war crime of illegally transferring population. And if that were ever to, materialize as an ICC case, that could involve prosecution or certainly investigation of senior Israeli officials. And so I think that is a looming situation that raises this same issue, though, for the ICC of whether it's appropriate to investigate and perhaps prosecute the nationals of states that have not joined the court. But if I could, I might just go back briefly to what you suggested in one of your early questions, which was this issue of hypocrisy and double standards. And I think for sure this is something the U.S. deals with, because from the perspective of a non-U.S. audience, the U.S. has seemed extremely eager to use international justice as a cudgel against regimes and individuals that it feels have violated norms. And the Yugoslavia, Rwanda cases, others would be examples of that. But at the same time, the U.S. is extremely hesitant and hostile to the idea of ICC jurisdiction over itself. And so I think that hypocrisy charge is serious. And it's a difficult thing for the U.S. to deal with. So I don't think we should kind of gloss over that as an issue.
Okay, so Ross, is it a hypocrisy worth living with?
Well, obviously, the U.S. is not going to view it as a hypocrisy, and the U.S. view is going to be that the situations that we've been talking about, where there were international courts created, were really to deal with those specific situations. And it did have not just U.S., but broad support around the world, whether it's a tribunal in Cambodia or other situations where specific tribunals were constituted. The U.S., again, and this goes across several U.S. governments already, and now it's already been many years since the ratification by some countries of the Rome Statute of the ICC, that they're not comfortable with this kind of organization giving itself this very broad power to investigate U.S. nationals. And there's just little appetite in the United States for something like this.
Okay, but at the same time, Ross, you have countries like Sudan saying, we don't trust the ICC. So in a sense, wouldn't you say it's the right thing for the ICC to go after Umar al-Bashir to see if he did all the things that they said that he did?
Well, again, the U.S. is not stopping the ICC from doing that. And if the ICC does that and they do have crimes to prosecute, the United States is not opposing that. But the United States is opposing the court, the treaty as constituted, and the authorities that it has, and whether it's to investigate U.S. nationals or to investigate the nationals of countries that have not ratified, or the situation with Israel, Palestine that we described earlier, which the U.S. is obviously going to stand by Israel. There's just a number of parts of the way this court and the treaty are constituted that the United States finds unacceptable. But that's really, frankly, not going to change.
But that's politics, right, Ross? Because you're saying the United States will obviously stand by Israel, right? So, I mean, to complete the sentence, no matter what, right? So it's politics, ultimately. You protect your allies and throw the book at those who are not your allies and let the ICC do whatever they want to, if that's
well, again, though, we do have examples over the last 25 years or so where international tribunals have been constituted for specific situations, and the United States has supported that. So to be fair to, again, successive U.S. governments and different U.S. presidents, the U.S. is not opposing in all situations the use of international tribunals to prosecute war crimes. Again, it's the structure of this organization that is very problematic for the United States. And we should add, it's not just the United States, it's other countries as well that have not joined this. It's not a unanimous decision among governments across the world.
But when we look at the other countries, it's invariably the likes of Syria. It's less likely members of the European Union and so forth, and more like the Assads and so on, right? I mean,
well, again, though, there are major powers, whether it's Russia or China. that are not members of the ICC. So
sure. They haven't signed up to the Rome
Statute.
Statute.
That the U.S. is the only country with objections.
Sure, fair enough. David?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add to that it's true. You have Russia, China. You've got India as well, one of the largest democracy in the world that has just chosen not to join. You have Turkey, which has decided not to join. So if you actually look at kind of world population and it's actually a big chunk of the world in population terms that lives under governments that have decided not to join. Right. But I think there's a real, I think one issue we need to consider here is less kind of from the U.S. perspective and more from the ICC's perspective, because the ICC has some real hard choices coming down the pike, and I think states that support and fund the ICC have some very hard choices. And I think a smarter choice for the ICC is to avoid those situations where it's going to be involved with potential prosecutions of non-member state nationals, to avoid situations where it has no support from, say, the territorial state where the crimes are alleged to have been committed, or from states that are in the region. I really think what member states of the ICC, and here I'm thinking of the primary funders, Germany, Japan, UK, Canada, they need to start thinking seriously about coming up with some kind of code of conduct or advisory guidance for the court that will allow it to focus on situations where it can actually succeed. Right. Because we have seen now so many investigations where the ICC is not succeeding. It's not succeeding on its own terms, and it's not having the kind of impact on those societies that it claims to have. And so I think that's the bigger problem, and it really is a problem for the ICC member states to address.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it's a really good point. And it reminds me a little bit of the nuclear debate as well, right? Investigating a state that hasn't signed up to the non-proliferation treaty. What do? You can't do anything. You still want to do it. They reject you, and you're kind of at this you're at this crossroads and you're stuck, right? But anyway, gentlemen, I've got to wrap. It's been interesting having this conversation with you. Hope to have you both on the program again. Ross Feingold and David Bosco. Thanks again. And that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Boeing says there's nothing to worry about despite 2 of its planes crashing in just 5 months. Are they putting profits before safety? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.